Automated Podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So welcome back to the Automated Podcast. Hope that everybody was able to take a break during the summer holidays. And as I mentioned previously, I planned for and did a 2-week trek across the Pyrenees Mountains. Now, this was both incredibly physically challenging, but I think also highly rewarding for both kind of the impressive mountaintop views, but more importantly, the kind of opportunity to have a bit of a digital detox, which I highly recommend to anybody in this fast-paced modern world that we're all living in. But of course, I am very happy to be back to continue to share these interesting conversations on future technologies, automation, and social impact with all of you. So with that, today's discussion will feature autonomous vehicles, and specifically their potential impact on cities and those of us, of course, who live in them. So my guest is Professor Nico Larco, and he comes on to explain both the positive and the negative implications for cities in adopting autonomous vehicles, how COVID may have changed things with regards to this technology, and how individuals will be affected by this powerful technology, as well as a number of other very interesting points in the discussion. So Nico Larco is a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Oregon, where he is the director of the Urbanism Next Center and co-director of the Sustainable Cities Institute. Urbanism Next is focused on how technological advances such as new mobility, autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and the sharing economy are changing city form and development. Nico Larco assists cities and projects with future-proofing, has run workshops nationally and internationally on this topic, and is currently coordinating work in the area with various municipal and state agencies across North America and in Europe. He also researches sustainable urban design, has developed the Sustainable Urban Design Framework, and assists projects in how best to apply these principles and approaches. His work has been covered by Wired, the New York Times, Forbes, the Financial Times of London, and Newsweek. And finally, Nico is a principal at Larco Knudsen, which is an urban design consulting firm, and he is also a strategic advisor at TNO, which is a Dutch think tank. So personally, I found this conversation to be one of the clearest in laying out how autonomous vehicles will reshape part of our society and lives. And I really hope that some of the ideas presented will not only be new to many of you, but also make you think a little bit deeper about the technology that we'll be discussing. Great. Well, Nico, thank you very much for coming on to the Automated Podcast. It's great to have you here today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. It's been a long time in kind of setting this up. I'm really interested in hearing your take on kind of autonomous vehicles and, of course, how they're going to be impacting cities over the next couple decades. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, great. What I do with all my guests to start off with is kind of get a little bit of a personal take on your idea on the specific topic. So if I could just ask you up front, like what initially got you interested in autonomous vehicles and maybe specifically how they've impacted cities?
So I for like 2 decades did work and continue to work on sustainable urban design. So think about how you can make cities that are more sustainable, equitable, all these things, and a whole lot of work around walkability and mobility issues. And as we were looking at the landscape, this was probably about 6 years ago on, all right, so what are like some upcoming topics that we should really be thinking about in terms of, city development, city design? We said, well, God, there's these big trends that are coming. We should start looking at those. So we started scratching the surface on new mobility, so AVs, TNCs, micromobility, microtrans, those types of things, AVs, self-driving cars, and e-commerce. And as we started to look into these things, all of a sudden you started, at first it was very exciting because there was no one who was looking at the impacts to cities. There was a lot of work on transportation, a lot of work on the kind of the technology, but not very much on how is this going to impact land use or urban design or any of these things. And so so as we started to unpack this, we were like first very excited and then a little terrified of what the implications might be. And that actually spurred a lot of the work that we've been doing for the last 6 years at Urbanism Next.
Very interesting. Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to getting into those, some of maybe the more terrifying aspects that this could have. Positive, of course, as well.
Yeah. There's positive aspects.
Yeah,
There's really good
yeah,
positive aspects, and then
yeah,
there's some things that we really need to be thinking about.
yeah. Couldn't agree further. I did watch your TED Talk, which I'll have linked up in the show notes, which I think everybody will want to listen to afterwards. And one of the things that you touch on there is kind of the previous automotive revolution. Could you maybe touch on that a little bit? I think it gives kind of a good context for where we're going forward in the conversation.
Yeah. So I mean, imagine if you like put yourself at like right at the emergence of cars in the US, right, or in anywhere in the world. Um, and think about what the landscape looks like, think about what development looks like, think about what opportunities are, right? And then think about this thing that's coming, right? That at first must seem like completely foreign. And for most of the population, not for me, this is like a plaything for the wealthy. For most cities, not knowing how to deal with the thing at all, or how big it's, no one thought it was going to be like the tremendous, like huge thing. The famous quote from Ford was, if you ask people what you want in terms of, in terms of mobility, people would have said like a faster horse.
Right.
And you're like, well, this other thing, this whole shift is possible. But you think about how it arrived and the impacts it ended up having on all of our lives, right? In terms of everything, of where we live, how we use resources, equity issues, economic issues, all these different things. And I would say very much with the automobile, we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants. Like the technology led, and it kind of like fell as it did, right? There wasn't a whole lot of like being proactive, thinking about what the future might be, thinking about how we might shape this this new thing to make sure that the deployment and the growth of it was in ways that really helped with societal goals. And I feel like we're still living with a lot of those problems from that original like kind of lack of foresight and lack of getting in front of the technology, would say, and not getting in front of it to stop it, but getting in front of it to like really steer it. And so a lot of the issues that we have right now with environmental degradation, all the greenhouse gas issues that we've got, issues that we have about equity in terms of mobility and access, issues that we have in terms of development patterns, all these things were affected by the automobile, and so I kind of feel like it's the potential is that we are in one of these moments again, right? So, and this is like the basis of Urbanism Next here at the University of Oregon, is this idea of like, well, these enormous shifts are happening. We have the opportunity to help shape these things. Well, what it requires is a whole lot of understanding what's going on and some foresight and forethought into what might be happening and how you might be able to shape those things. So I see like we could be at a very similar moment where the decisions that we're making today, the things that we're testing today, the things that we're thinking about today, the ways that governments are structuring themselves and structuring the deployment of these technologies could shape our future for years, decades, to come. And so that I feel like we're in a similar type moment.
I think that's maybe a perfect way for the kind of the audience to understand that, there is this kind of large, possibly momentous event that's going to be happening over the next couple decades. And it's conversations like this that I think maybe can trigger some people to either take action or even start thinking about some of these things that we'll be getting into. So I have talked about autonomous vehicles on the podcast a couple of times already. I've mentioned it, like the DARPA challenge in 2004, but I think you also, you definitely know kind of the timeline that autonomous vehicles have had. So if you could maybe just spell that out for us, because maybe the entire audience doesn't necessarily know like where these kind of important points when it comes to autonomous vehicles have actually happened.
Yeah, well, so I mean, like the DARPA challenge was the kind of the first realm or pass into like saying like, really, is this possible? Is this doable? And then more recently, there's been huge innovations happening that are part of cars everywhere, right? So I assume if the audience isn't familiar, there's these 5 levels of automation that people talk about. Level 3 is what we're at right now, which is a whole lot of like driver assist, cruise control, all these types of things, and it's in cars everywhere, and it's increased safety, and that's pretty pretty well understood. The big pushes that are happening are what's coming, which is level 4 and level 5. And level 4 is that you can drive, or an autonomous vehicle can drive itself without the need of someone intervening, right? Which is, what a lot of AVs are right now, is actually that there's a safety driver and can take over. But the idea is that they could do that without someone intervening in specific situations. And what do we mean by specific situations? So, on freeways, on maybe most roads in a city, but not all roads in the city. Maybe they can't deal with like really complicated intersections, and maybe they can't, deal with rural roads or like unpaved areas, right? So that's level 4, and then level 5 is that it can go anywhere, right? So like, and my guess is like level 5 might never happen, and in fact, it's not even that important that it happens. Level 4 is the really big kind of turning point. And in terms of like recent things that have happened, I actually don't remember all the dates right now. It's been a while since I've talked about these things. But a few years back, the first AVs arrived in the level 3 AVs arrived in the U.S. Uber started that in Pittsburgh, and at the same time it was happening in Asia. And that, for the first time, there was a car that someone could get in and take them around with a safety driver, but that would be driving itself. Those things have continued to evolve. Waymo right now has a service in the Phoenix area where they have level 4 automation. So this is where someone can get into a car who is not a Waymo employee, like you or I can get into a car, call it, comes in, we get in, it takes us somewhere, and there is nobody in the car except for us, right? There's absolutely nobody. And that's been happening, God, for, I want to say 2.5 years now, right? And now the big question is continuing that deployment, expanding it. 2 years ago, Waymo opened a plant in Detroit to actually create AV vehicles. So take standard vehicles that they're purchasing and transform them into autonomous vehicles. So this wasn't like a shop to like do one at a time. This was a plant to
production
help,
plant,
mass produce these things. And that is, the pandemic has definitely stalled things out as well. But that is still, we'll say it's not full capacity right now. It's not like running tons of cars through this. And we started to see new deployments. So level 4 has now been, and the ability for AVs to take passengers around as a commercial enterprise is now allowed in California, and there's some permits that have been put out for that. So we're seeing this development of AVs, slow development coming out. And one of the things that I really want to mention is that a lot of people ask, when will AVs arrive, right? When is this going to be here? And the thing that I think it's important for people to understand is, on the one hand, they've already arrived. In other words, they exist in places, right? And on the other hand, there is no like one answer of when it will arrive, because it's arriving at different times in different locations, right? So, so some of the questions asked, like, when will AVs arrive on freeways, right? So that we can go, anywhere in the U.S., let's say, in a freeway, or when will we be able to have like a metro area that has all the AVs AV allowed, right? Or having companies be able to work there. Or when will it be allowed in a place that has snow, right? So, right now the places they're deployed are sunny areas with we'll say milder weather, and typically, for Arizona, large streets with not a ton of pedestrians, right? So you have to think about this slow sequential rollout in terms of where it's going to be and when. Is it going to get to New York City tomorrow? No, right? New York City is going to be way down the line. It's so much more complicated of an environment. Is it going to be in in Amsterdam? Well, that's way down the line. That's a really complicated environment just for the number of people, but also the urban form, right? Paris, really complicated urban form. These small windy streets, really strange intersections. So you can think about this kind of slow deployment happening over time. And the first ones, as you see right now, cities with grids, large streets, and mild weather. And a lot of the testing right now is actually like to expand that range.
One of the kind of trends that keeps coming up on the podcast, especially in the most recent episodes, is this kind of juxtaposition between the U.S. and China. So, I mean, I know that you're situated in the States and you probably have much more experience, but also many more examples of what's happening in the States. I've been trying to kind of follow as best as I can about what's happening in China, but could you maybe touch on that a little bit? Like, is it comparable to what's happening in the States? Are they more advanced? Maybe picking on some of these maybe more low-hanging cities that are available for these autonomous vehicle deployments to happen?
Yeah. So I can tell you that in the last year, the amount of information that I've gotten of what's happening in China has reduced substantially. As
Mm,
like there's been less and less conferences and abilities
right.
to track some of these things. I'll tell you the there's a whole lot of advancements happening over there, and there was the same kind of proclamations that we're hearing here of like in 2 years we're going to have X numbers all over and those things have not happened, right? So the rollout is still more methodical, we'll say, than what was being said a couple of years back. One of the big issues that China has that we could say is a benefit for the deployment of the technology. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a benefit for the overall outcome, but is that there's much more, the regulatory structure is obviously less democratic. And so if the government says like, well, this is something we should be doing or we should be testing in these areas, then it is allowed by right, and there you go, and there will be support for these things. Which in the U.S. is much more nuanced and difficult, and the relationship with the city is kind of an important thing that the AV companies are paying a lot more attention to. In terms of where the technology is going, who's going to get there first, I think that's still very much up in the air. In the U.S., the obvious leaders are Waymo and GM Cruise. Are doing like they've got the most number of miles kind of logged. There's a whole host of other companies that are, I think, not far behind, but those are the two leaders here. Didi's really pushing a lot of things in China. Unknown where who's gonna end up really figuring this out first or most. Yeah.
So I think the listeners would hate me if I didn't ask, but where does Tesla compare to this? Because I think Tesla gets the most amount of press from maybe all the other ones. So could you touch on that? I know it's potentially a controversial topic, but
yeah,
nonetheless.
So, and I should mention, like, I am not an expert on AV technology, right? I mean, what we mostly look at is the impacts on these things. So I'm a consumer of a lot of that information, but I'm not by no means an expert. I'll tell you, all the companies that we've talked to who, and they've got their own interests in this, so take it with a grain of salt. But they say, the big difficulty that Tesla has is that it is based all on, it doesn't use LiDAR.
Yeah.
And so LiDAR is a laser kind of 3D understanding of what your environment is, which is more complicated and more expensive. And so Tesla does not use that technology. All the AV companies I've spoken to, which all use technology, so again, take it with a grain of salt, say that it is completely irresponsible to be trying to create AVs in sophisticated kind of environments without using LiDAR, and that we will continue to see more and more accidents as that happens. So that is a big sticking point. If it turns out that Tesla's like onto something and you can really do this, and they are promoting it much more, in my opinion, much more than they probably should. It's kind of hard to call something, what's it, the fully automated driving when it is not fully automated driving. That is creating problems, and you see it in the crashes that have happened. My sense is we'll continue to see more of those, and then the big question is, are those crashes because the technology is not there yet, or are those crashes because that technology will never get there?
Right,
and they need to really rethink the entire piece of that. So I put them a little bit outside of because of that, what I've been hearing from a number of the different companies and people who really track the technology side of this. And that adds a whole nother, which maybe we'll talk about later on, of the question of like, are these things privately owned or not privately owned? Which is a huge kind of difference.
Yeah, I think it's really good to give maybe a little bit of a critical perspective on Elon Musk and Tesla in general, because I've had many discussions with some of the listeners on this specific point, and yeah, there's really kind of two camps of people that are completely for and completely against. So, and I think the kind of people that are completely for have a lot of kind of media attention to kind of focus and support their opinion. So I think it's really good to hear a bit of a critical response of that. I also kind of agree with what you're saying generally,
So
as I understand this. Yeah.
so I'll say one other thing, which, again, we'll see. Maybe we'll be proven wrong, but the companies that I've all spoken to have said they do not see private ownership of AVs as like a real viable thing in the foreseeable future, because of how complicated the technology is and how complicated the maintenance is, right? So,
Right.
is your sensor working right? Is there a problem with your, with your operating system? Is there, or the software? Is there now an updated one that should be put in, right? So the example that I always give is, are all your programs running on the latest version right now, right? I'm sure you've gotten notices about that. How quickly do you make those upgrades? And some people don't make upgrades for years, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that we could say that about our cars as well, right? Oh yeah, there's a certain other thing. Well, it's fine. Maybe next time that I go to get it serviced, we'll think about that thing. That's fine when it's our computer, right? It's fine when it's our phone. When it's a safety critical like piece of machinery that's couple tons like hurtling through space, that's like a big issue. And so there's remains to be seen with Tesla, like what happens when the Tesla that you buy today, 3 years from now there's a really important safety upgrade that you just don't go about getting, right? And then that causes a crash. The complexity of it, the need for constant maintenance and upgrades and updates, and the safety risk are like, it's hard to put all those things together and think like, oh yeah, we're fine. This people will be responsible all the way through and it's going to work out.
Yeah.
So that's again, I could be completely wrong, and Tesla could be like really have figured out a way of making all this work, and 5 years from now they'll be driving themselves around everywhere. I find that as a difficult to believe. You can never say that you're not going to be wrong in this, because there's so many things have gone in different directions, but
sure.
I find it difficult to believe right now.
Okay. Well, there's some good points to be hesitant about the specific move that Tesla is going down. Super clear. Why don't we transition a little bit more towards like what you are a specific expert in? So, right, the impact on cities, which I think is one of the kind of the main bulk aspects of the discussion that we wanted to have. So, I mean, everybody is maybe everybody isn't aware, but like we are living in an urbanization trend, right? There's the growing mega cities. People are leaving the countryside and have been leaving the countryside for years and generations and moving more towards cities. Could you maybe touch on that a little bit, and then like maybe also connect it to this growing need for autonomous vehicles, or for just vehicles in general?
Yeah. So cities, the urbanization has continued to grow, ever since the dawn of cities, ever since like the Industrial Revolution, right? Like there's been more and more growth in cities. I think we are about to hit 50% of the global population in cities, or we just hit the 50% of the population living in urban areas. And cities are definitely getting larger and larger. There's been a big question with COVID. Will cities go away? I'm a tremendous proponent that will not happen. If you look everywhere throughout history, we like being around each other. And if there's ever been a problem with cities, or people being worried about cities, what typically that means is that you move to the edge of the city. You don't like move out into the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So even with COVID happening, we still like to be around each other. We still like to see each other. And even though we can do things like this, which is absolutely great, I'm like dying to be at a conference where we get to like actually talk to people, and the chance encounters, and also all the energy and activity that cities give, all the opportunities cities give, everything from economic opportunities, but also like social and cultural opportunities. I mean, cities are so important kind of pieces. As cities continue to grow, as we get more and more urbanized, mobility is a key part of the whole equation, right? And some of the questions that have come out, I mean, some of the why AVs, right? The biggest first answer has to be safety, improvements to safety. If there's not improvements to safety, then there's no reason to really like go through. I mean, AVs are not an easy technology. It's tremendously complicated. It's costly, right, to put together. So unless there's a real benefit that's coming out of this, and increased safety is being one of the most important ones, then that's not going to happen. And then after that, then there's all these other things. Well, you're like, okay, so let's just assume that there's a version of AVs that is safer, right? Then what are the impacts going to be to cities, and how, with this big growth that we're having in urbanization, and urbanization is not just compact cities, but also like sprawl, right? Huge urban agglomerations. What are the impacts going to be on cities? And that's a lot of what we really look at.
Right. And I think you mentioned a couple of them in your TED Talk, right? So before that, one of the first things that I had always heard of is parking. There's something like, you can correct me on the numbers, but it's something like 90% of a car or most vehicles' lifespan is spent parked somewhere, not being used, not being turned on. So maybe you could touch on that, and then we can jump into some of the other ones.
Absolutely. So the vast majority, more than 90% of the time, your car is parked, and unless people are listening to us right now, like as they're driving somewhere, that's where all everyone's cars are. That's like the reality. So and then that parking space is not just, your car's not just in that parking space, but there's a parking space for it, at your home, at your place of work, where you're going to go shopping, where you're going to pick up your kids at school, right? That, like, there's parking everywhere. So in the US, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but there's something like between 4 and 8 times the number of parking spaces than there are vehicles, right?
Crazy.
And according to Donald Shoup, the high cost of free parking, if you haven't ever looked at that, he's fantastic, kind of a guru of what parking is and how it's affected all of our worlds. According to him, the largest single land use outside of or in terms of floor area, in terms of a footprint, is parking in most any city, right? And if you've ever worked in architecture, urban design, landscape architecture, you know that form follows parking. It is just an enormous decider of how our cities are organized, where we spend time, how we spend space. Having low density development means that we've got parking in front of us, which means we need these roads, which then means I need parking at the place that I'm going to be going to shop and work, which just expands, the metropolitan footprint, lower density, like huge. AVs have this tremendous opportunity to tremendously reduce parking. So there's been studies that say between 80 and 90% reduction in the amount of parking that we need in any one city. And that is a huge game changer for us, right? So there's just an enormous amount of land that's right now is used for parking that now can get reutilized, right, for other things. So you can, as you build new things, you can actually put more density on that space, right? So if I've got a parcel that I want to develop, if I don't need the parking for a vehicle, then all of a sudden I can build much denser. So one of the biggest limitations on density is not what the regulations say you can build in terms of units. It's usually, how do I fit that with parking? At least in the US, this is definitely the case. So if you eliminate that, also land that had been existing as parking, you no longer need to have that, right? So all these empty lots can now actually become development, right? So huge opportunities for doing that. And then another big, fantastic opportunity with this is that parking costs a lot of money, right? We that's usually hidden within the cost of our goods or services, or hidden within our rent. But if it costs a significant amount. So if we no longer need that, then we're actually reducing the cost of housing. So great for affordability. One of the things I should probably mention is why we're going to need less parking. I probably should have mentioned that before.
Yeah, I think it was connected to the idea that we had, or that you were mentioning before, about the shared versus private ownership of these vehicles, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah. So the idea is, I mean, we often say that like Uber and Lyft's, like TNCs, transportation network companies, are like AVs. They just happen to have drivers. And what we mean by that is that the model of how we use them is exactly like an AV. I call it, it shows up, I get into it, it takes me somewhere, I get out, and it goes off and does something else. So AVs are going to be a similar model. Well, what do we see with Uber and Lyft? Well, you just need a huge reduction in the amount of parking that you need for this. I call the vehicle, it comes and gets me, it takes me somewhere, and then it goes away. It doesn't need to be stored, right? There didn't need to be stored where I was, and it doesn't need to be stored where I'm going. And now it's going to be used again, right? So the things that you see is much higher utilization rates, right? So instead of being used 6% of the time, right, a vehicle, maybe you're getting 50% of the time it's actually in use, right? Because now when I'm at my office, someone else is using that same car to go somewhere else. And then you don't need that storage component. And, so this is particularly true if they're shared vehicles, right? So if we all have if the Uber and Lyft model kind of shared vehicles, we can absolutely do that. But even if they're private vehicles, right, there's a chance that instead of needing two cars, maybe I can get away with just having one car, and like it takes me to the office, then I send it back home to go pick up the kid, or run an errand, or do something like that. So and the other thing is, even if I still need parking, I don't necessarily need it. If it's a private vehicle and I want the vehicle to be near me, I don't need it to be at my site, right? It can be half mile away. So, we could create like a place that has, just tons of stacked parking, and everything goes in there, and, we call it as we need it. So it's a really big shift in how we use land in urban environments. And, to me, this is like one of the biggest benefits of the whole AV future, outside of the safety issues, this impact on land use and parking.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. Maybe also like connected to this, we were discussing at the start of the episode, like both the positive and the negative aspects. So if I can pull out one thing that I think would be kind of negative regarding the impacts on cities in this, if we're going to have much denser cities, right, we're going to have more people per square kilometer or square mile. I would assume that there might be more like crime, there might be more stress, there might be more kind of some negative social interactions that would happen if we're packed like sardines in these cities a little bit more. Have you come across studies, or have you studied this yourself as to like a more dense urban area compared to one that's a little bit more spread out?
Yes, but yeah, and this, I think that all that research is outside of AVs, and it's totally interesting. And there's a lot of the work that I actually done historically. And like density does not need to mean like New York City, we'll say like an oppressive density,
Sure.
right? Density can absolutely exist with livability. Tremendously dense area, like most of the Netherlands is tremendously dense, right? So I think it's the densest country in terms of development in all of Europe. And these are like 3 to 5 story buildings that are attached, and this beautiful urban form, right? Like really walkable, really friendly, very comfortable. I mean, people go to these places for vacation because it's so beautiful, right? So it doesn't have to be oppressive in the least. The important thing is then how you develop, right? So can you develop a density that also has all sorts of amenities? Do you have open space and parks? Do you have access to all your services? Is there good transportation, outside of AVs, like transit? Is it well served by transit? So all these, is there structured open space, but also natural open space, including these things? So density does not have to be an oppressive type of thing. And also, at least in the United States, it's not hard to get denser than what we have, right? Like there's so much single family sprawl, right? That the idea of having more dense development, it can be slightly denser, and it's a huge improvement.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. One of the other things that kind of came up, I think that you already mentioned, was like the commute times, right? So if we're having, autonomous vehicles, there was one of the terms like where they're able to chain together, maybe on the highways, able to create kind of a convoy of vehicles rather than being stuck in rush hour traffic. Which, I mean, I used to live in Canada, and I would go to Vancouver every single day from my house, and it takes like an hour to do maybe a 30-minute actual drive. So I think that this is one of the things that many of these autonomous vehicle producers are pushing, right? That if we have autonomous vehicles in these large fleets, transit times, rush hour traffic, et cetera, are going to be significantly reduced as to what we're seeing today.
So lots to unpack in that. So one of the questions is, will commute times be reduced? And if we get to a majority of the cars on the road being AVs, I think absolutely that's possible on like freeways and arterials, right? So if you think about going on a freeway and being able to like, have the cars be much, much closer together, right, as they're going.
Right.
And you don't have all the stalling that happened. One of the biggest generators, you've seen this before, right? You're stuck in traffic, and you get to like the place where all of a sudden it loosens up, and you're like, there was no accident here. What was
Right.
going on, right? It's pretty much like people, one slowing down in front of the other, and like people like shifting lanes and all that. So you think, oh my God, with AVs, you could eliminate a whole lot of that, right? There could be, you could really make the entire network much more efficient, especially on freeways and arterials. There's still the question of how does that work in urban areas in terms of, when I get off of the freeway and if I'm going to a more urban area, the movement within the cities might not be that much change from what we're seeing today. And so this is one of the things, early on, I haven't seen it lately, but early on, there was a ton of engineers that were putting out studies, transportation engineers putting out studies where they're showing like, AVs crossing intersections at high speeds, right? Like, being just because they can talk to each other in time and like, perfect. Yes. And I always said like, that's great if you live in a city that doesn't have people, right? Because if there's pedestrians, they still want to cross the street, there's cyclists, they still want to move around. And so I feel like in dense urban areas, we're not going to see a tremendous amount of change. In the larger commutes, right? So like the kind of going on freeways, yeah, absolutely, you're going to see some benefits. And I think, this has serious implications in terms of, and to me, this is like one of the biggest negatives of AVs, potential negatives of AVs, if we're not careful, which is that the pressure it would put on sprawl, right? So if you can commute faster, right, the car's going to move faster. That's one thing. And then the second thing is, if during that commute time, you no longer feel like that is a lost bit of my day, right? Oh my God, that 40 minutes I'm in the car, like, is just, stress inducing, and I like wasted my time, right? Well, now that time, I don't have to look at the road. I can be sleeping, working, watching a movie, having dinner, maybe potentially doing exercise, right? All sorts of different things. Then maybe, so the average commute in the US is 26 minutes, 27 minutes, right? So maybe I'd be willing to do like 35 minutes or 40 minutes, right? Because now it feels like productive times or positive time. And so if you put those two things together, that it can move faster, especially on freeways, and and I'm less bothered by the amount of time. And I do believe that there's an upper limit to that, right? I'm not interested in being an hour and a half in the car every day, in each direction. Right. But if those things can happen, then all of a sudden, maybe I'm willing to go a little further out, right? So if my main desires are, I would really love to have, access to open space, or I really want to get to, less expensive land, right? Which the further you go out, the more affordable it is. Then there's going to be pressure to do those things. And so the pressure on expanding your metropolitan footprint will be large. And that has all sorts of problems, as again, the background I talked about with sustainability, land consumption, potentially resource consumption, not just in, how the energy to move these vehicles, but we have to build those roads and we have to maintain those roads. And then, how are we affecting habitat and all these? And what does this do to equity issues, right? So who has access to these things, and who can live further out or not further out? How, sprawl, suburban development has not necessarily been a good thing for equity, right? And so this could exacerbate some of those things.
So it really doesn't sound like there's an easy solution to that. It sounds like there's many more of these conferences and discussions that have to happen. Or am I completely wrong?
Well, no. I think you're right in that there's not necessarily an easy solution. I think the solution is not technology based. The solution is, the things that we've been working on for years, which is like smart growth development, right? So how do we create more dense development, more like attractive, wonderful, livable, dense development? How do we get transit to be able to work more? How do we have like, better open space systems within these? How do we increase density, right? I think those things that we've been working on for a long time in like urban development continue to be true. I always say like the old rules are still the new rules, right? So compact, dense, mixed use, multimodal, that is still the AVs are not going to solve any of those things. In fact, they could make those things worse. Those are still the things we need to be doing, and then we need to figure out how we put AVs into the service of those things.
Right. Okay, that's clear.
I mean, the goal, which sometimes when you talk to people who are immersed in the AV world, the goal is not to put AVs on the road, right? Like, by no means is the goal to put AVs on the road. The goal is to like have communities that we love and enjoy, right? and that I would say are sustainable and equitable at important in my world, right? Yeah. So let's figure out how we can shape this technology to help with that. And in the ways that it doesn't, we need to mitigate or not allow. Absolutely.
Yeah, like many of the technologies that we discuss on the podcast, right? Technology is just a tool to whatever end that you want, and you need to help guide or navigate that transition towards whatever kind of end result that you want. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Technology is not the answer. Technology, like your goals as a community are the answer. Yeah. Technology is maybe a means to get to those things.
Okay. Great. I also see the time is winding down a little bit here. There's one last point that you brought up specifically in your TED Talk that I wanted to talk about, and this is the impact on CO2 emissions. And this is something that I've had actually numerous debates with some of my friends over the past couple of years. So, of course, the Teslas of the world, the Waymos of the world are saying that with autonomous vehicles, CO2 emissions can have this drastic reduction. When I was one of the first times that I was actually introduced to autonomous vehicles, it was through a book, and unfortunately I can't remember the name, but one of the main arguments in it was critiquing Google's self-driving car before it turned into Waymo. And one of the things that they were saying was, well, it's actually going to require so much extra data in order to run the actual vehicle, right? The amount of bandwidth that's going to be required, probably 5 or even 6G at some point in the future, is going to be required in order to have these things properly running. And the data servers are going to have such a massive increase in usage that it might, and I don't know the numbers specifically, but it might even out. So the benefits that you gain for CO2 reductions for implementing autonomous vehicles might be like lost with these increased use in data servers. Do you have a point on that, or is it completely off what this guy was writing?
Yes and no. So a couple things. So yes, the future is going to be electrified, right? I mean, I really think with or without AVs, like we're heading in that direction, and that is great. Most AVs, I think about half of the AV pilots that are happening in the world are in fully electric vehicles. About another half of what's left, or a quarter, are in hybrids, and then the other half is all gas powered. But it seems like you're heading in that direction, and part of the reason is that it's not just the server kind of piece, but the car requires a whole lot of electric energy to run, right? These computers that are running the AV systems are not light and they take a lot of energy. So that's one question. But then there's all these other pieces of, okay, well, if it turns out that we go through AVs, there's a ton of variables, we'll say. If we go through AVs that are very much like the Uber and Lyft model of TNCs, well, what we see with TNCs is you're seeing, 60 some odd % increase in the vehicle miles traveled per actual person mile travel, right? Because you have all this deadheading that's happening and like inefficiencies in the system. So if we go that route, like maybe like I've saved a whole lot because I'm not using petroleum in my car, but on the other hand, I have all these empty vehicle miles that are happening, right? Or even if they're privately owned, right? So I've like just went to the office and now I sent the car back, right, to be used somewhere else. And so there's lots of questions with that. Not to mention all the other pieces of like, well, if this really leads to sprawl, there's tremendous CO2 emissions issues based both on land consumption and on other development types that, the single family home uses a ton more energy than more dense development, right? So all these things are kind of tied together. So I don't think there's an easy answer one way or another. I would say that I'm not convinced that we are not solving our energy problems through electrification of vehicles, and definitely not through AVs. I continue to go back to like these other core things: compact development, mixed use, dense, all these types of things. One thing I wanted to mention though is what you just mentioned that this writer talked about was like the servers and all that. The AV companies that we've talked to have all said that they don't require 5G to be able to run their vehicles. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that the companies we've talked to have said, we want all the technology on board. We don't want you having to like talk to other things or get information from other places to be able to run. One, because there's the whole like communication problem, but two, also hacking is a huge issue.
Right,
So
right.
we want this thing to be somewhat hermetically contained, what it senses and what it knows, right? And how it processes things internally. That's one reason. The other reason is if you need 5G to be able to go anywhere, the percentage of roads that you can go on is tremendously limited,
Right.
right?
That's a good
So
point. Yeah.
it's like saying like, oh yeah, we can drive on any road that, you know, like has an elevated like middle lane. And you're like, okay, who's going to build those things? Right? It's great. I get to like, you know, half a mile of roads in my city, right? So
Right.
the companies are really, they're not banking on the 5G because that would really limit the how much it could go around. And so yeah, all that's internal.
Okay. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's a significantly more complicated debate than I think. I mean, we could have an entire podcast episode on just that
Oh
one
God,
point,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the whole energy implications,
Yeah.
and then also, you know, obviously with electrification, one of the big questions is just what do you do with all those batteries,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily known yet.
Yeah. Trouble in and of itself. So maybe we can I mean, we're talking a little bit at the kind of the macro level, right? Like the large scale city impacts and like even the design of the city of the future. Can we maybe just quickly focus on like the impact to the individual? One of the first things that I came across when I was looking at autonomous vehicles was kind of this critique. And again, this is more closely related to Google's self-driving car, which I know doesn't really exist in that form anymore. But there was, you know, with the free time that you might be having in your commute now, there's the opportunity for autonomous vehicles to have screens instead of windshields, and there would be like significantly more ad revenue generated by Google, which is, you know, some people are saying that was the reason that Google got into the self-driving car game. I mean, you did mention like kind of the benefits, you know, you could be working, you could be sleeping, you could be exercising, etc. Are there any kind of
You could be
other
shopping, right? That's the other question.
yeah. Like what are some of these other impacts to the individual user of these autonomous vehicles?
Oh, this goes down a very dark place.
Okay.
If you know Jeff Tumlin, who's now at SFMTA, he's fantastic in some of the scenarios that he paints. But so what he said years ago, he's like, you know, if AVs end up taking off, and it really is the data, which is the data is the business model, right? So Uber said a couple of years back that, you know, we happen to take people around, but what we're really interested in is the data, right? That like everyone's going to do everything through some kind of Uber affiliated piece, because what we have is your attention and your eyeballs, and, you know, we can direct, and we know what you're interested in. This could be a really dark place. So you know, Jeff Tumlin said years ago, like, you know, it's possible in an AV future, the ride's going to be free. What you're going to pay for is to turn off the ads, right? And if you've ever been in a cab in New York City with like the screen in front of you that's like constantly doing ads, it drives me crazy. It drives me crazy. Like, I mean, it's like, it feels so, or, you know, it happens now at gas stations, right? That you go to a gas station, you're pumping, and they're like showing you ads all the time. And so that is absolutely a concern. The other side, which a number of people have talked about, is this idea of because of that like data piece and understanding you and trying to get you to do shop other things, right? So an example of like, I call up my Waymo that comes picks me up, and I say, you know, I want to go to dinner, you know, take me to this restaurant, right? Like put in the address, and they say, you know, as we're driving, they're like, you know, if you're really interested in, you know, Chinese food, there's a place just up the road that here's a coupon for $5 off, right? Or, you know, I just saw that your friends are at, you know, so and so a place, you know, why don't you come over here? Or so the ability to, I mean, think about it, they have your attention, right? You're in an enclosed space. There's the possibilities of like, you know, giving you a tremendous number of ads and all this. And they are moving you, right? Like, it's like it is a tremendously powerful position to help sway what it is you're going to be doing. And yeah, and a lot of that is going to depend on our willingness to be inflicted with these things, to accept these things, right? That I'm willing to have these ads happen, or I'm willing to data privacy, right? Huge kind of issue of like right now, you know, I just saw, and hopefully this won't date the podcast, but, you know, in California, there's been a call to relook at the lawsuit against MDS, right? The mobility data specifications, right? So how it is cities collect data about how you're moving around in micromobility, and now increasingly, hopefully, moving to TNCs and such. And the debate is, cities should not be allowed to have this information. So, like this is like, it's like a breach of privacy, all this. And my question is, how is it companies are allowed to have this information? If cities can't have this information, why is Google allowed? How does Apple know that I'm in my house right now?
Right.
Right? Like doing these things. Like how is this information allowed? Right. So if it turns out that, we continue down the road of like, which we've, Europe is doing much better than the US in this, but that we've decided to forego privacy for all the benefits that we get for the not privacy. I think there's going to be potentially painful ramifications for that. And then also say, like with the New York City example of, cabs with ads in them, we seem to be able to accept that, right? So like, I'm sure if you would have said, 50 years ago, like they're going to be advertising to you nonstop, you'd be like, what is this? I mean, it seems like a bad version of, a Blade Runner or Minority Report or something, right? Where it's constantly, but somehow we accept that, like, the city hasn't said like you should stop doing that, right? Well, that's a revenue model, and like, let people choose what they want to do. So it really might be that if you're wealthy, what you get to do is you get to go into a car that doesn't have that advertising, right? I mean, that is like more or less the subscription model we have right now, right? I can get Hulu with ads, or I can pay more and have Hulu without ads. And that could be our transportation model in the future.
It's a little bit scary. You're painting a little bit of a dystopian future, dystopian vision of what could be if we're using these autonomous vehicles. I see that the time is nearly up here. I mean, there's so many other questions that could be asked. I mean, we've already talked a little bit about like what the future could look like with autonomous vehicles. One thing that we didn't really discuss, though, was the impact of COVID on. I mean, we talked a little bit about how conferences are being reduced, and maybe some of the production plants are a little bit slower. Are there any other kind of like main important things that COVID brought to the autonomous vehicle industry, and specifically its impact on cities?
So, so one of the big questions I think that comes out of COVID, and I really think that, in a few years, I hope that in a few years this is going to be like, I can't believe we thought this was a question, right? But the big question was, will people still want to share anything, right? So and even like, the most optimistic is share vehicles, right? Or share in like that we're all in transit together, right? Or sharing a ride, right? Versus sharing a vehicle that, I used it and then somebody else is going to use it, right? Early on in COVID, there was a big question of like, well, all sharing is done. It's never going to happen again. And, if it turns out that COVID continues, and I'm a little where we are right now, end of July 2021, we're seeing the Delta variant like resurging, and you think like, oh my goodness, like this, we could like have these continuous peaks that go on the way through. That would be detrimental for so many things, right? If we no longer feel like shared space is shared and closed space, right, is a viable piece. And that would have tremendous effect on AVs in that it would have to be private ownership, right? Or we would never go to shared models or shared rides or shared vehicles. That's going to have a huge implication for the rollout of this technology. Absolutely. The other big piece, as I mentioned, that is a big question is, where are we going to want to live and how are we going to want to live, right? So if COVID was the end of cities, which, as I said, I do not believe in the least, then that's got huge implications because, the whole AV and shared AV model doesn't work so well in less dense areas, right? So the shared AV model definitely doesn't work well in those areas. But even the AV model, right? Waymo would love to have a market which is, Portland. I live in the city of Portland in Oregon, in the U.S. Portland, great, done. We're going to deploy there. If it's really like small towns everywhere, right? That's a much harder model. Like, how do you map all that stuff? It becomes much more complicated. So, but as I said, I don't think cities are going anywhere. I think we're going to continue to live in these things and really love living in cities.
Yeah, but the impact on the autonomous vehicle market might be quite severe, especially if these waves keep coming over the next several years. Yeah.
Very
interesting. Are there? Yeah. If
I
there's
was,
a last thing that you want to discuss about like kind of the impact that
yeah,
autonomous vehicles
well,
have, please go. Yeah.
yeah, and this is broader not only to AVs but generally. I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the reckonings that's happening right now in the U.S. A lot of conversation around this question of um, how do you have a viable business model in the transportation sector, right? Transportation is very difficult to make money on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, unless you're making cars, which it turns out that actually those are very subsidized as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through all the infrastructure that we build as a society and the subsidies directly to the companies. But transportation is a very difficult sector to make money in. And so you see that in, Uber and Lyft still losing tons of money. The
Right.
car sharing, almost gone, right? There's huge setbacks in that. Micromobility, still not viable, like that there's a way to make money on these things. AVs, huge question mark of is there really a viable large scale model for this? And so to me, it brings up an important question in terms of the role of cities, which
Mm.
is instead of cities thinking, what's the technology that's coming and how do I extract money from these things, right? Which has been a lot of the kind of rhetoric around TNCs and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
micromobility. The question really needs to be, what are the outcomes of this technology, and does it benefit my city? Does it benefit my community?
Mm-hmm.
If it does, I need to find ways of helping promote that thing, right? And to the extent that that money spent on this actually helps with the goals in a better way than other investments might
Yeah.
make.
Yeah.
But if it turns out, for instance, that scooters are an excellent investment, right? Let's say like they reduce emissions and they increase equity and like they reduce injuries and increase safety, and all these things are still being figured out. There's
Yep.
not those things are happening, but if so, maybe governments should help pay for those things the same way that we subsidize transit, right? If they don't, then maybe those things should wither. And I think the same questions will come out with AVs, right? That, like as I mentioned, the goal is not to get AVs on
Yeah.
roads, right? The
Yeah.
goal is to get to community goals. If the community goals align with what AVs can provide, and especially if you think AVs in transit might be a fantastic solution, right? I mean, that is I think a wonderful thing, or potentially AVs in freight, that might be
Yeah.
also a fantastic opportunity. Then yeah, the government should help make those things happen. If it turns out that there's really large downsides, you have to kind of a cost benefit analysis of those things and figure out what direction, what makes sense to invest in and what makes sense to maybe put limitations on, or let kind of go on its own with regulations that help limit any negative externalities.
Hmm. Well, maybe that's a perfect place to end the discussion. I think leaving this kind of idea for the audience to think about, what kind of future do we want, and do AVs fit into that kind of future? I think that's maybe a perfect place to end. Nico, thank you very much for coming on. Where can people find you, follow you? I said I'll have your TED Talk up on the show notes, but if there's one place or a couple places that you want people to follow your work, please let me know.
So I say, yeah, urbanismnext.org, urbanismnext.org is the site that we have for the research center, and we have a lot of information there, both in reports and research that we do, but also we have something called the Nexus, which gives people an orientation around all these topics. There's the Urbanism Next framework, which is really helpful. The other way, on Twitter, I'm on @Nico Larco. Yeah, love for people to reach out and follow the work we're doing and give us your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure discussing some of these interesting ideas, both the positive and the negative. And I hope the audience as well got some interesting insights from you on autonomous vehicles and the future of cities. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation, and I look forward to more.
Terrific. Thanks again. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback, or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, There are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.